So today is Wednesday, the 1st of February 2012, and I'm with Cornelia Parker in her studio in London, and thank you very much for meeting with me. And Cornelia, it would be nice if you could say a little bit about your origins as an artist, as it were, what your training was, and how you entered the art world a little bit.
Well, I was brought up in the countryside, rural Cheshire. There was no history of art in my family, and no history of going to college in my family. My eldest sister studied music. I decided I wanted to study art. Went to Wolverhampton, went to do a foundation at Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, which was miles away, but I managed to get a grant to go out of my county. Went there because I thought I didn't really want to be in a city, because of being a country girl. Spent a year then, and went to Wolverhampton Poly, which is as city as you can get, on last pool choice, so I didn't get in any of the colleges that I wanted to get into, but I got into Wolverhampton, which I loved. And that was a very, very good thing for me in terms of aesthetics, because Wolverhampton was a grim place aesthetically, full of derelict houses and part of the Black Country, industrial Midlands. But it kind of attuned my eye in a different way. After that, I went to an artist in residency in Clore Leadership College, which wasn't that far from where I was brought up. And it was a creative arts degree. The students there were doing drama, dance. They could do a degree in sculpture and dance, for example, or writing and singing. So it was kind of it was the first degree course of its kind in the country. So I got involved with the students doing, choreography, making sets, doing things that I would never have done at art school. So that was a great thing for me. And I still got a lot of friends from those days who are more performance orientated. After that, I went to Reading University for 2 years, and then moved to London. I didn't go to London Art School. In the 1984, I moved to London.
Did you have a sense of a moment, because you're now very much acknowledged as an artist, do you have a sense of a kind of breakthrough moment, or a moment when you thought, oh, I've kind of arrived now, I'm kind of understood? And
I think it's been very incremental for me. I mean, there's been lots of little breakthrough moments. I remember winning a competition when I was at Clore Leadership College. I got first prize in the Midland View, which my tutor at college came second. And I thought, I've made it. but obviously that wasn't. It was a minor thing. But I suppose there's little moments like that you think, oh, right, people, other people are appreciating what you do. I think moving to London in 84 and making work in my home rather than in a white, space that was designated for art, like a studio or art school, was kind of major for me, because I was working in my living room or in my bedroom, and there's other people in the house, and I was kind of making things using found objects, things around me, rather than thinking about art. And I think when those definitions of art and the art materials and my life got merged, then I kind of made progress in a different way. So I'd invite people back from the pub to show them my work at home, on the living room ceiling or corner of a bedroom or in the gutter outside. I made all the little installations all over the house, and I didn't necessarily have a place to exhibit them because they were kind of knitted into the fabric of where I lived. But then some of those works were shown eventually in New British Sculpture in 1986 at the Air Gallery, which is no longer existing, but it was a kind of trying to, Vonna Blazwick, who's curator of the space, was trying to find the next generation of artists, sculptors, after people like Anthony Gormley and Ish Kapoor, who'd shown in a New British Sculpture show. So this was a kind of second wave, as it were. So people like Stephen Pippin, trying to think of the other people, Julia Wood. I mean, there was, I think I and Stephen Pippin might be the two artists in that show that kind of moved forward, I suppose. then, so that was, I remember writing a letter to I didn't know of Honor, and I wrote to this letter saying, I've got these works in my house, would you like to come and look at them, and she did, and she put me in this show, which I don't think happens too often nowadays, but that seemed like a breakthrough to be in a show called that.
That's a lovely story, writing the letter. And, I mean, now if you think about your work, I mean, do you have a sense of a position in terms of your practice? I mean, I'm not talking about I want to talk about your practice in a moment, but in terms of the position that you occupy in the art world, do you have a sense of what that is?
I suppose I've always thought of myself as a bit of a maverick outsider, A, because I didn't go to a London art school, and I wasn't really part of the YBA movement, I wasn't, I fell between the two generations, really, I suppose, between the Manish Kapoor and Anthony Gormley generation, Richard Wentworth, and the YBA, Damien Hirst and that generation. So I was kind of without my peer group, perhaps. But I think I've always quite liked this position of not being people able to place me where I should be, because I always thought art was about freedom and about not having a position in the hierarchy, as it were. And I quite like maintaining that position if I can.
Mm. And in terms of the work itself, I mean, do you see your preoccupations of being, as an artist, as having been consistent over that period of practice? Or, I mean, are your current preoccupations the same that they have been?
I think a lot of my work, I'm not, one thing leads to another, and things sometimes go round in circles or spiral, as I like to think. You come back to the same point a few years later, but perhaps in a slightly different position, but you're retreading the same ground. And I think my concerns and preoccupations are most probably being quite consistent, but on a very subconscious level. I'm not trying to work systematically in any way. So I always think I'm reinventing the wheel every single piece I make, and those works might take all kinds of different forms. I suppose consistently people are thinking my work in terms of suspension, and I think suspension is a theme that's permeated my work, not necessarily literally suspending, but things being in a kind of limbo place, whether it's a wire drawing or an interview with Noam Chomsky or a literally suspended work or site-specific work, so or photograph. And so I seem to jump around all over the place. I think I'm jumping around all over the place, but really there's a kind of, there is a pretty firm foundation underneath it all. I almost trust my intuition, because I will presume that everything will just link up, which it does.
Mm-hmm. And this interview is about kind of artist leaders. We're beginning to kind of think about this term, artist leader. And if you hear that term, what does it scan to you? I mean, what are your first thoughts about that term?
Well, it sends a chill through my heart, because I don't want to be a leader. A leader presumes that you're an authority, that that there's something you can teach, that this is this path that you can lead people along. Because my path is going round in circles and up and down, and I like being lost, I suppose. And if you're a leader, it presumes you know where you're going. So for me, although I've been called upon to be a leader many times, and I'm always resisting it, not being a head of department at a college where I was teaching, or I get requests all the time to be an external examiner, or to be a head of committee, or be on all these kind of boards. And I have been on different boards, but I'm never really. I never wanted the position of power, and leadership and power seem to be bound up together. And all my work is really about undoing power. So and being lost. So for me, it's a kind of curious term.
I mean, it's very interesting, because talking to artists about this term generally, there is a kind of sense that there's a disavowal of the idea of leadership in terms of its kind of popular meaning in relation to artists, and when I ask you about, or what artists are doing, when I ask you about your take on it, the way that you understand it is in terms of these things that are kind of associated to but external to your practice. In other words, external examiner or course leading, etc., etc. So I suppose what I'm interested to know or to think about is how your practice itself and what you've been doing as an artist, and this, what you described as a spiral or reinventing the wheel, coming back to the same issues again and again, might be a different form of leadership, or a form of leadership that is in distinction to the kind of conventional understanding of what leadership might be.
I mean, I think the idea of leading by example, I get hundreds of letters from students and school children and all kinds of people, sort of saying they enjoy the work and they're inspired by it. And I love the idea of, being a catalyst. As if being a leader is being a catalyst, then I'm very happy about that. That people look at my work and, and are inspired by it in some kind of way. But for me to drop my practice and then take on a different role, which is, consciously thinking about instructing, I find problematic. And I had taught for 15 years in art schools, very much on a visiting lecturer basis, so I would not have to do admin, get caught up in sort of more sort of administrative roles, because something about leadership, I like the idea of saying to students, you might not know what you're doing yet. Artists, students are always asked to define what they're doing constantly, to be able to formalise and to be able to rationalise what it is they're trying to achieve. And ultimately some students carry on to do PhDs on that work, writing up the theory of it. But I'm always saying, you don't necessarily know what you're doing. You might think, you might have a concept, you might have an idea that you're pursuing, but really the real meaning and the real sort of fruition of the work, it comes out of a sort of faith. It comes out of you trusting your intuition and instinct, and making mistakes and ending up with something that tells you something. You think, wow, okay, I can understand this more through the actual physical doing of it. Not going straight from your heart to your hands rather than through your head all the time. Although I'm very often stuck in my head, so I always practice what I preach. But this, and then we do reverse engineering on it. When I was teaching at Goldsmiths, I remember the dreaded convener groups, which would happen ever so often, and my group of students would all be very panicking about what it is that their work was saying, and then and I always encourage them to make the work, and then we could sit around and extrapolate, do reverse engineering on it. And that might be more constructive, because I always presume your unconscious knows much more than your conscious mind. And as an artist, you really want to be tapping into something that's, the greater society might not be able to on a daily basis, because the emphasis is all about, accountability and, sort of targets, and but somehow that making art should not necessarily be about those things.
So, if you think about what your practice is doing in the world, I mean, if we kind of hold this notion of leadership in brackets for a minute, or just suspend it for a moment, and you think about what effect your work is having, and it's interesting in relation to kind of popular consciousness, because I think that a lot of your work is understood and appreciated outside the boundaries of a kind of conventional art world audience, and I think people have a kind of visceral response to it as well, and quite an emotional response often. I mean, how do you think about that effect that you are creating in the world?
I mean, I don't really, when I'm making the work, I think about that at all. I'm trying. I'm usually struggling with something that's a pithy thing for myself that has a, it usually requires. I mean, I don't find I make work easily. It can be quite a struggle to make the work and to tease out what it is that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and feels intuitively right and feels it's got the right timbre of emotional charge, and I presume if I get that right for myself, that it will strike a chord for someone else. That if it feels like it's got this electrical charge, that's the spark that will allow it to be disseminated and for people to use it for their own interpretation. Because I think the work needs to have this empty space in it, not empty space, but potential space in it that people can occupy. I've just made my first bronze last year, which for me, I thought I'd never make a bronze in my life. It was for the Folkestone Triennale down in Folkestone, and I, for some reason, decided that I was going to make a facsimile of The Little Mermaid in Copenhagen. Well, not a facsimile, but my own version of it. But I wasn't going to make an idealised, female form modelled, because I can't model. I'd take a real person from Folkestone and ask them to be this mermaid. So I sent out, leafleted the whole of Folkestone and asking for models, people who are prepared to take their clothes off and sit on a rock and sit in the pose and be cast, made into bronze. And had about 50 replies of people sitting in their living room or on the sofa or on the buffet in the garden or whatever, wearing swimsuits, striking the pose of the Little Mermaid. I said it didn't matter what age or what shape they were, because it wasn't about having this almost prepubescent, model that the original one was modelled on. So I got all these people back, and in the end I chose this one person who's 38-year-old mother of two, quite ample figure but not fat, and she, had her photographs had this amazing self-confidence, it just felt like she already was statuesque, and so she was cast sitting on this rock. And now it's, this piece is a permanent piece on the seaside in Folkestone, and people, interact with it all the time. They like at Christmas they dressed up in Santa outfit. She's been wearing policewoman's outfit or a bunny outfit, or there's lots of funny images people send me back of little kids sitting on her lap, or adolescent boys trying to breastfeed her. And so she's being used by the community for whatever, she's become part of the community. She's got her own life. And I love that. It's kind of weird. I never thought I'd make a piece of bronze public sculpture, but somehow that's happened. But I think what's good about the sculpture is it's real. It's not, she's got slight cellulite showing through, or, it was a record of her on that particular day in that particular year, and she's got a couple of kids, and they come and sit on her lap, and I love the idea that when they get old, they might bring their kids to sit on the lap of this, person who's a real person. She's now talking about setting up a shop, like a mermaid shop.
Wow.
So I don't know. I like the idea of the work having its own life, basically.
So if you take that example, that's a great example. Here that work is doing a number of things. One, it's asking us to rethink this original, statue of this prepubescent girl and the kind of historic representation of women and young girls. Then there's this kind of notion of the contemporary, what it means to be a real woman, and there's also this way in which it's affecting and servicing a community in a certain kind of way. All those kinds of things you could imagine being part of a conventional political even discourse around social mobility and contemporary culture, and you can almost hear that being the kind of driver of some kind of socially motivated political agenda. I'm not saying that was your agenda, but what I'm trying to do is to think about ways in which art is changing or transforming communities, and or lives, or people's understanding of the world around them, and that being a kind of service or a role or of public good. And I completely appreciate that when you say that that's not where you start. You start with grappling with something in the studio, but nevertheless the effect is transformative on society.
I mean, I usually grapple with it on the bus, or the studio is not necessarily the place I grapple with it. But that particular piece, for example, if that been made as a piece of publicly commissioned work in a public, this was a temporary festival. The work hopefully will end up being permanent. It is permanent. It's there. But if I'd gone through a different structure there to make that piece of work, I bet I would not have been able to make the work I did make, because I've tried this on numerous occasions. I've always stepped back from making public art because, it has to tick so many boxes. It's almost like it can't be transgressive. There's all kinds of things that sculpture has that if it had been through a different filter wouldn't have been allowed to be made. So I very rarely do anything that's permanent because it really has to go through a sieve that actually ends up as making some anodyne work. So artists, that's why I like the position of maverick, really, or when I've done things which are more informal collaborations with, like, say, the British Army or the Customs and Excise, or where, I just ask them to help me on a particular project, but it's not me being an artist in residence there, or it's just me coming from outside and asking something that's quite simple, like a day of their time. Somehow doing it on my own without going through some kind of public art filter allows me to do something a bit more transgressive, or a bit more destabilising, or and there's enjoyment on both sides of the equation. That for the army it's kind of enjoyable to blow up a garden shed rather than do some other tactical thing, applying all their skills to a domestic situation, for example, rather than targeting some enemy in a foreign field, as it were. So my little collaborations are usually initiated just by me, and they're very, they're off-piste, as it were. But the leadership, or the formal role of artists in a community doing a piece of social sculpture is a bit more problematic for me to negotiate. I mean, not for other artists, because they're perhaps very skilled and very adept in those situations, and have accrued that knowledge over a long period of time, and it allows them to do exactly what they want underneath those conditions. But I think perhaps for my own psychological makeup, which might be slightly fearful of authority, or might have some relationship that I'm trying to work out with that, is more difficult for me to engage with.
And so if you don't identify necessarily with this term artist as leader, but if you were to imagine what it might be, like if you forget what the kind of notion of leader is in the kind of political or governmental sense or business sense, have you got a sense from what you've already said of what the difference might be that an artist brings to these situations? I mean, it seems demonstrable to me by your work in a way, but I mean, no one identifies themselves as no one in any field really says, "Oh, well, I'm a leader."
Yes.
But if you are to try and understand that in a kind of abstract sense, even if it's not kind of applied to you particularly, is it useful?
I don't find the word your leader useful. I mean, I think of an artist like, say, John Jordan. Do you know his work? Yeah. Who's almost like his artist protest, and he's obviously a leader of a form of protest, and so it requires corralling quite large numbers of protesters to a certain point at a certain place at a certain time. So it's sort of kind of what's happening in the Arab world at the moment. You know, there's a lot of kind of leadership going on that's for the greater good of the community, we hope. And it's all kinds of people that are popping up and taking the helm. And that they're almost like spontaneous acts of leadership. And I think as a spontaneous act of leadership, I can imagine taking on that word just for a few moments. You know, and that, but I think when it becomes formalised from people outside art who, you know, I mean, I've been invited to be lead artist on various projects, and I've always said no, you know, because somebody else's idea of what a lead artist should do might not be anything like what I might want to do. You know, I think it depends who's calling the shots on the word leader. You know, as a spontaneous acts of leadership, I've certainly had over the years, and I hope to have in the future. But I very often can't quite manage my own life, let alone anybody else's.
I mean, because I've been kind of thinking about this thing about leadership over the last year, and it's quite difficult to kind of, in any context, to kind of make a definition of it. But my kind of working definition of leadership across the board is a creative behaviour that is conscious and intentional about change. And if that is a definition of leadership, it seems to me to describe your practice very well. A creative behaviour that is conscious and intentional about change. And why I was particularly interested to talk to you is that a lot of the work that you've been making is kind of counterintuitive about creation, that it's often about deconstructing or looking at something, or destruction as creation. And this seemed to me to kind of really flip on its head. Your practice over, you know, the last 30 years or whatever has really flipped on its head the notion of what creation might be in itself. And that, to me, seemed to be an example of you leading, maybe accidentally, maybe not intentionally, leading through your practice a kind of new vocabulary of creativity in a way. And as, you know, as a kind of emerging artist myself, that was very influential to kind of rethink what creativity itself might be. Now, if I put that to you, I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, I'm grateful that you've made that definition, but perhaps I should be called what's leader backwards? Redial. Redial.
Brilliant.
But you know, I think I suppose I was very influenced when I was a student by reading Edward de Bono's Lateral Thinking, you know, about this idea of that the received idea was a big deep hole, and the experts were at the bottom of deep holes, you know, that they would dig away at this on the one spot, you know, and that education was all the stuff that was known, and that you were sitting on the edge of this big hole, and that in a way to go off and dig lots of little holes, which might be quite shallow, but might end up finding some new material, because, you know, it's almost like, I think I've been quite inspired by that, the idea that you don't fall into the received hole. You try, you know, you can't be a naive person. I can't be a self-taught artist because I've been through 6 years of art education, but somehow I don't want to become a craftsperson or too adept at anything. I want to always be kind of be at the rock face, as it were, uncovering some new idiosyncratic way of making, which comes to do with fumbling and having not the right skills to be able to address that particular rock face. So you find little toe holes that other people might not have used because you never learned to climb, and you've got a fear of heights. Sorry, I'm getting all my metaphors all mixed up here. But I suppose it's just my default position is always to see if I can undo something and redo it. You know, it's almost, or, you know, that even getting attracted to the things that are very cliched, like, you know, The Little Mermaid. There's something about that that's beguiling, that, you know, it is almost like the received idea plus, but it's almost like you you use that as a material. So this received idea, this hole that experts fall into, it's almost like if you could reverse that hole, would it become a mountain? Inverted or expert, you know, it's somehow it's trying to use that as another physical thing. Sorry, I've dug myself a hole here.
No, I think that is beautifully put, and I think that's really helpful and inspiring in a way. And it seems to me that I completely see why you're resistant to this to this word leader, because it's like why you're resistant to kind of becoming too adept. I thought that was kind of really nicely articulated, that you've constantly got to be kind of learning in order to discover something new, and the second you become too skilled, you know, the possibility falls away somehow.
I mean, that has happened in my working process. You know, some things I'm drawn to do over and over and over again. Squashing is one. Perhaps I'm getting too good at squashing, but you know, it's a kind of, it becomes almost like a fetish, and I think, oh dear, you know, and then you know it's almost doing it to the point of its disintegration, as it were. And so there is some things in my own work that I've, you know, there's been repeated attention to, and then there's other things that the opposite of that as well. But sometimes the repeated attention is because I'm trying to squash it thinner and thinner and thinner, and then it almost falls apart, and then you're onto a new thing. But I think I really admire artists who have pursued a very simple, straight path in their lives, like Solomon Witt, for example, who or Richard Long. That kind of, there's a repetitiveness there that's, but the more they do it, the deeper they go, and they're, you know, it is like this received idea, but they've dug their own particular hole. But I dip in and dip out, and you know, run off with my little bit of inspiration from those people, and then take them back. I'm a nut gathering. And then a little bit of that might infuse something that I do. But I'm very jealous of them in a way, because I can't be like that. I'm the opposite. I'm sort of destined to reinvent the wheel daily.
Well, on that note, Cornelia Parker, thank you very much indeed for talking to me.